Welcome to Daily English Stories. Every story hides a world. Some inspire, some haunt, some stay forever. Chapter 1. From the Communal flat to the KGB. In the gray, cold streets of post-war Leningrad, a city still healing from the scars of World War II, a young boy named Vladimir Putin was born on October 7th, 1952. The city bore the silence of loss, and the air carried the weight of survival. Families shared tiny rooms in crumbling buildings where walls whispered stories of hunger, hope, and war. In one such communal flat, barely large enough for a small table and 2 beds, lived the Putin family. Simple, hard-working people trying to rebuild what life had taken from them. Vladimir's father, a factory worker and a former soldier, was strict, disciplined, and proud. His mother, Maria, was gentle yet strong, the kind of woman who could make soup from almost nothing and still share it with a neighbor. They had lost 2 children before Vladimir's birth, and so to them he was a miracle, the fragile hope that survived in the ruins of a broken city. As a child, Vladimir was quiet, observant, and fiercely independent. He often played alone in the hallways and courtyards, studying the way people moved and talked. School didn't come easy for him at first. Teachers thought he was distracted, uninterested. One even called him addled. But deep inside, the young boy had a mind that never stopped questioning. He was always asking why and how about everything around him. In those early years, books became his escape. He devoured adventure novels and spy stories, tales of courage, mystery, and secret missions. He admired characters who lived in the shadows but changed the world silently. Among them, one name fascinated him the most: the KGB, the secret intelligence service of the Soviet Union. To many, it was a mysterious organization. To young Vladimir, it was the symbol of power, loyalty, and discipline. He made up his mind early. He would become a spy. But dreams were not enough in a place like Leningrad. The streets were rough, and fights were common. Putin was smaller than most boys his age and often became a target for bullies. Yet he never ran away. He decided to fight back, not with anger, but with control. That's when he discovered judo. At 13, he began training under strict Japanese discipline. The sport taught him patience, focus, and respect, not just for others, but for his own strength. He once said, "Judo teaches you to think, not just to move." It became his philosophy for life. Every throw, every fall, every win and loss shaped him into someone who didn't fear challenges. He studied them, adapted, and turned them to his advantage. By his teenage years, Vladimir had grown into a determined young man with sharp eyes and a calm expression. He no longer reacted with emotion. He observed, analyzed, and planned. While others dreamed of comfort, he dreamed of control, of mastering himself and his destiny. To reach the KGB, he knew he had to be educated and disciplined. So he entered Leningrad State University, where he studied law. It wasn't just a subject for him, it was a strategy. Law meant understanding systems, authority, and the balance between power and order. His professors remembered him as intelligent but quiet, someone who spoke only when necessary and always with confidence. It was during these university years that he made an impression that would follow him for the rest of his life. His ability to stay invisible, to listen more than speak, and to calculate before acting. He learned German fluently, knowing that language was another tool of influence. Every choice he made was deliberate. each step carefully measured. Finally, after years of preparation, his childhood dream came true. In the mid-1970s, Vladimir Putin was accepted into the KGB, one of the most powerful and secretive organizations in the Soviet Union. He began his training with pride and humility, understanding the weight of the responsibility he was taking on. The boy who once read spy stories in his cramped room was now becoming one of the very people he had admired. His career took him far from home, to East Germany during the tense years of the Cold War. There, he worked in intelligence operations, gathering information, learning the art of patience and silence. He was never the loudest man in the room, but always the most observant. His colleagues respected his precision, his calm under pressure, and his refusal to show fear. Life in East Germany was both thrilling and lonely. Putin lived quietly, behind walls of secrecy, watching history unfold from the shadows. When the Berlin Wall began to crumble in 1989, he witnessed not just the fall of a barrier, but the end of an era, the collapse of a system he had been trained to protect. He once stood outside the KGB office in Dresden as angry crowds gathered, demanding change. The Soviet government was silent. No orders came. For the first time, he realized that power, without control, could vanish overnight. That moment left a mark on him, a lesson he would never forget. When he returned to Russia, the Soviet Union itself was collapsing. The nation he had served was no longer the same. But deep inside, Vladimir Putin was already transforming. The boy from the communal flat had grown into a man shaped by struggle, silence, and strength. He had seen the fall of an empire and the fragility of authority, and he knew that someday he would build something stronger. In the stillness of his small office, surrounded by fading documents and fading dreams, he reminded himself of the lesson he learned long ago from judo. You must not let your opponent throw you. You must use his energy against him. That was the moment when a quiet ex-spy began to prepare for his next fight, not in the streets, not in the gym, but in the heart of Russia's power itself. The boy who once dreamed of becoming a spy had completed one chapter of his journey. The next would make him something even greater, a leader who would change the course of his nation's history. Chapter 2, The Rise to Power. When Vladimir Putin returned from East Germany in 1990, the world he once knew had vanished. The Soviet Union was collapsing, its economy shattered, its people uncertain, and its pride wounded. Leningrad, the city of his childhood, was now called St. Petersburg again, a symbol of how much had changed. The once mighty empire he had served as a KGB officer was no more, and the uniform that had once given him purpose suddenly meant nothing. But where others saw chaos, Putin saw opportunity. He understood that power was never destroyed, it merely shifted, and if one had the discipline to adapt, it could be reclaimed. In those uncertain years, Putin quietly left the KGB, closing one chapter of his life. He wasn't a man who craved attention or fame. He was a man of systems, of control, of order. That mindset led him to a new field, politics. He joined the administration of Anatoly Sobchak, the reformist mayor of St. Petersburg and one of his former law professors. Sobchak believed in change, in rebuilding Russia through democracy and progress. And Putin became one of his trusted aides. In the mayor's office, Putin worked behind the scenes, reviewing contracts, organizing trade agreements, solving problems with quiet precision. He rarely spoke in public, but when he did, his words were sharp and calculated. People around him began to notice his rare combination of loyalty and logic. He didn't flatter, he didn't shout, he delivered results. Over time, his reputation grew. He was the man who got things done, the one who didn't panic when others did. When political storms hit, Putin stayed calm like a chess player waiting for his opponent to make a mistake. But the political winds of the 1990s were merciless. Russia struggled with economic collapse, crime, and corruption. Sobchak eventually lost his re-election, and with him, Putin lost his position. For a brief moment, it seemed like his political career was over. Yet true to his nature, he didn't complain. He simply started again. He moved to Moscow, where his discipline and professionalism quickly caught attention. One small role led to another. Within just a few years, he was appointed to key government positions, first in the Presidential Property Department, then in the Security Council. His rise was quiet but steady. By 1998, when Russia faced one of its worst financial crises, Putin had become known in Moscow's inner circles as a man who could be trusted. President Boris Yeltsin, who was struggling to keep control of the government, needed someone dependable, loyal, and untainted by scandal. And in 1999, he made a surprising decision. He appointed Vladimir Putin as Prime Minister of Russia. The country barely knew his name. Journalists called him a mystery, an unknown man from the shadows. But Yeltsin saw something few others did, a man who could restore order to a country on the edge of collapse. Putin accepted the role with his usual calm. He didn't celebrate or boast. He simply began working methodically, relentlessly. Within months, a series of bombings and conflicts in Chechnya tested his resolve. While politicians argued, Putin acted. He launched firm military responses, declaring that Russia would never be humiliated again. His words were strong, his tone unshaken. The people, tired of weakness and chaos, began to listen. When Boris Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned on December 31, 1999, Vladimir Putin became acting president of the Russian Federation. On that winter night, as fireworks burst above the Kremlin, the quiet ex-spy from Leningrad had reached the peak of power. But for him, it wasn't the end of a journey. It was the beginning of a mission. In March 2000, Putin was officially elected president of Russia. His campaign was simple: order, stability, and strength. To a nation exhausted by uncertainty, his message felt like a promise of safety. He spoke with authority, not emotion, with reason, not rhetoric. He reminded people that Russia had once been powerful and could be powerful again. Once in office, Putin moved quickly. He targeted corruption, restructured the tax system, and tightened control over regional governors. He rebuilt Russia's image abroad and worked to stabilize the economy through energy and trade. The price of oil rose, businesses began to recover, and slowly, confidence returned. For the first time in years, many Russians believed in their future again. But beneath the surface, his leadership carried a new kind of strength, one that demanded loyalty and control. He believed that too much freedom had weakened Russia, and now discipline must restore it. To his supporters, he was a savior, a man who brought back dignity. To his critics, he was a reminder that too much power in one hand could be dangerous. Yet for Putin, leadership was not about pleasing everyone. It was about protecting what he called the Russian soul. He once said, "Anyone who doesn't miss the Soviet Union has no heart, but anyone who wants it back has no brain." It was his way of saying that Russia must move forward, but on its own terms. He surrounded himself with a circle of trusted men, many from his KGB past, people who valued loyalty above all else. Together, they rebuilt not just the government, but the system itself. Putin learned that politics, like judo, wasn't about brute force. It was about balance, timing, and using your opponent's strength against them. In just a few years, Russia had changed. Its voice was louder, its borders more secure, its economy stronger. And at the center of it all stood a man who had once been dismissed as quiet, now commanding one of the largest nations on earth. But power has a way of testing even the strongest. As the 2000s unfolded, Putin's influence continued to grow. And so did the questions about how far he would go to protect his vision. For him, Russia was not just a country. It was a mission, a living legacy he intended to defend at any cost. The world began to take notice. A new leader had risen from the shadows, calm, calculating, and unshakable. The boy from a small communal flat in Leningrad had become the man who would reshape modern Russia. And as history turned its next page, one thing became clear. Vladimir Putin's story was not merely about power. It was about control of his nation, his destiny, and perhaps of history itself. Chapter 3. The Legacy of Power. When Vladimir Putin first stepped into the grand halls of the Kremlin as Russia's newly elected president, he was not simply entering an office. He was stepping onto a battlefield of politics, economy, and ideology. The country he inherited was still struggling to find its footing after the fall of the Soviet Union. Inflation was rampant, industries were collapsing, and millions of Russians had lost faith in their nation's future. But for Putin, this was not a reason to retreat. It was a call to rebuild. He began by stabilizing the economy. With calculated precision, he strengthened Russia's control over its most powerful assets, oil and gas. The energy sector became the beating heart of the nation's revival. Under his leadership, Russia's economy began to rise from the ruins, and ordinary citizens started to feel a renewed sense of stability. Salaries were paid on time again. The ruble grew stronger. Streets that had once echoed with protests began to hum with cautious optimism. For many Russians, life was finally improving, and the man at the center of it all was Vladimir Putin. But Putin's ambitions stretched far beyond economics. He believed that Russia's greatness could not be measured by wealth alone. It had to be earned through respect and strength on the world stage. He moved swiftly to modernize the military, introducing new technologies and reorganizing command structures. His message to the world was clear. Russia would no longer bow to anyone. As years passed, Putin's leadership style became both admired and feared. He was a master of control, calm under pressure, rarely revealing emotion. His meetings were precise, his words carefully chosen, his tone always firm but never frantic. World leaders soon learned that beneath his quiet demeanor was a man who calculated every move like a grand master playing chess. To negotiate with him was to enter a game where the stakes were always high, and Putin almost never lost. Domestically, he sought to restore a sense of pride among his people, Through national celebrations, sports victories, and a revival of patriotic education, he rebuilt the image of Russia as a strong, united country. In 2014, when the Winter Olympics came to Sochi, it was more than a sporting event. It was a statement. The world watched as Russia showcased its culture, its talent, and its confidence. To Putin, it was proof that the country once written off as broken could stand tall again. Yet his rise also came with criticism. The same discipline and control that made him successful also led to accusations of censorship and authoritarianism. Independent journalists and opposition figures began to speak out against restrictions on freedom of speech and political dissent. Western nations questioned his methods and motives, painting him as a ruler who valued power over liberty. But inside Russia, many saw him differently. For them, he was the man who had brought order after chaos, a leader who had restored dignity when the world had turned its back on them. Behind the scenes, Putin's personal life remained largely private. He lived with the same discipline that had shaped him since childhood. His mornings began early, a swim, a workout, a cold plunge. He read reports meticulously, studied world history, and analyzed his opponents. Those who knew him closely said he rarely relaxed, that even in moments of calm, his mind was constantly turning, planning, predicting, preparing. His belief was simple. To lead Russia, one must first master oneself. His leadership extended far beyond borders. Putin built strong relationships with China, India, and nations in the Middle East. These alliances shifted the balance of global power, allowing Russia to regain influence once lost after the Soviet collapse. He understood that the world respected strength, not sentiment. So he cultivated both. His diplomacy was deliberate, his timing impeccable. When he spoke, even his critics listened, because whether they agreed with him or not, they could not ignore him. Through years of political storms, sanctions, and global tension, Putin remained steady. His approval among Russians stayed high, driven by the belief that he had defended their interests in a world that often misunderstood them. To many, he was more than a politician. He was a symbol of endurance. But history, as always, is complex. To some, he was the man who revived a fallen nation. To others, he was a ruler who tightened his grip too much. His legacy sits between these two truths, a balance of order and control, progress and power. And perhaps that is what makes his story so remarkable. For Vladimir Putin, greatness was never about charm or popularity. It was about strength, of will, of discipline, of conviction. He once said, "He who does not regret the collapse of the Soviet Union has no heart, but he who wants it restored has no brain." That statement revealed the essence of his philosophy, pragmatic, restrained, and unshakably focused on Russia's future, not its past. As the years turned into decades, Putin became one of the most influential and controversial figures of the modern world. His story is not one of comfort, but of control, not of ease, but endurance. Whether admired or criticized, his legacy remains written in the steel of his character and the resilience of the nation he rebuilt. And so, the boy who once lived in a cold, communal flat in Leningrad grew into a man who shaped the destiny of a superpower. From judo mats to marble halls, from shadows of the KGB to the spotlight of global politics, his journey is a reminder that power, once earned, demands not just intelligence, but relentless discipline. Vladimir Putin's legacy is not defined by what the world says about him, but by the simple fact that he changed it forever.